All right, we talked about much earlier inside this course, we talked about variables. When we assigned variables a value. Remember, that's all variable was. It's a way for you to store a value for later use, whether that's a string or an integer or some list that you're storing off that you can later use, whatever the case. Someplace in memory, you're storing a value so you can pull it out later. Now, I want to talk about how variables relate to functions. And more specifically, I want to talk about the scope of a variable. Essentially, where the variable is available to us to use and to use appropriately with the correct values. Take a look. So I've got the shell interface open, I've got a new document open, and right away, I'm going to create a variable and I'm going to assign it a value of 10. That's it, right there. Variable called total equal to 10. Now I'm going to define a function called addNums, and I'm going to pass in two arguments here. Argument 1, argument 2. There's my function definition right there. My function identifier called addNums. Now that function is going to have a variable of its own called total, and it's going to be equal to the results of arg1 plus arg2. All right, that sounds good. And within there, I am going to print total. All right, I'm going to drop out of that function. So I'm now outside that function. Here, I am going to print total. All right, now let's get a little bit of a clearer picture of what's happening here. We've got we've got a variable here called total, which is now being assigned the value of 10. We've got a function called addNums that also has a variable called total, which is receiving the sum of the two arguments, and then we're going to print that out. Outside of the function, we're going to print total. Now, in order for this one to print, I need to make a call to that function. So let's actually make that first. addNums, and we'll pass it 3 and 3. All right. Now, this deals with the scope of the variable. Here, we've got a variable outside, right? Variable outs, oops, let's put a pound symbol there. Outside the function, all right? Now this one here, this is inside the function, right? So let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. I'm gonna go ahead and hit F5. All right, 6 and 10. So what do we have here? We got the results of 3 and 3 being added together, which is the total here. And we got 10, which is coming from this one, which is the results of the assignment of that variable here to be equal to 10. So it's the same variable, or is it? They're both called total, but they really are two separate variables. When you create a variable inside of a function, it receives what's called function scope, meaning that that variable is available and accessible within that function. But as soon as the function's done, that variable says, I'm done, gone, no longer relevant. So outside of the function itself, we have a variable here, total equals 10. This is what we'll consider a global variable. This variable happens outside of the function, unless we pass it into the function, has no bearing there. It didn't change what this guy was, didn't affect it in any way. We could pass it in, but it's outside of it, so it's got scope outside of that function. This is a very important concept and one that you got to practice and you're going to deal with. You're going to run into issues of your code where values aren't coming out the way that you intended them to. And it might have something to do with the scope of the variable. Just know, if it's declared inside the function, it's scoped to that function. If you do it outside, we could use it anywhere outside, but it doesn't interact with the functions or the variables inside of the functions, unless you explicitly pass it into that function. And just to demonstrate that, if I do this, if I say, let's get rid of this, let's say add nums, and I do total as one of the arguments there, right? And then I do a 2. That should print it. Yep, let's go ahead and save that, and I'll run it again. So we got 10 and 2 being passed in where it should add them together and then print it out to us. There's my 12. So unless you pass it, you explicitly pass that in there, it's hands off. The function's doing its own thing. It's got its own arguments inside there. Otherwise, it's scoped to the function itself. So try this out. Again, it takes a little bit of practice getting used to it, but it's all about the scope of the variable and where it's accessible and what values you're going to get.